I am your host, Nero Wolfe. Let's begin our journey.
I was in the office, finishing the morning mail, and wondering if the price of typewriter ribbons was going to stay north of reasonable forever, when the front door bell rang. Usually Fritz Brenner handles the door, but he was currently 3 floors up in the plant rooms with Theodore Horstman, discussing the merits of a new orchid hybrid that looked like it had been designed by a committee of delirious butterflies. I checked the monitor. Standing on the stoop was a man who looked like he'd been pressed between the pages of a very heavy, very expensive book. He wore a charcoal overcoat that cost more than my car and held a briefcase like it contained the original drafts of the 10 Commandments. Beside him was a younger version, a carbon copy with less grey hair and more anxiety. I went to the front, slid the bolt, and opened up. "Mr. Wolfe?" the elder one asked. His voice was like dry sherry. "I'm Archie Goodwin. Mr. Wolfe is currently occupied with his orchids. He doesn't see anyone without an appointment before 11, and even then, he doesn't like it." "This cannot wait," the man said, stepping past me with the practiced ease of someone who hasn't been told no since the Truman administration. "I am Arthur Penhaligon. This is my attaché, Mr. Graves. It concerns a matter of national and personal sanctity." I led them into the office. Nero Wolfe was still upstairs, which was just as well. If he had been in his oversized chair behind the desk, the sight of 2 uninvited diplomats would have sent him into a fit of silence that could last through dinner. I gestured for them to sit. At 11 on the dot, the elevator groaned. It's a sound I know better than my own heartbeat. A moment later, 1/7 of a ton of genius and stubbornness waddled into the room. Wolfe paused before the visitors. His lips tightened the equivalent of a volcanic eruption for any other man. "Archie," he barked. "Who are these people?" "Mr. Arthur Penhaligon," I said, leaning back against my desk. "Former ambassador to the court of St. James. He says it's urgent. National sanctity and all that." Wolfe crossed to his desk, adjusted the seat of his custom-built chair, and sat. He didn't look at Penhaligon. He looked at the stack of mail ID left for him. "I am not a public servant, Mr. Penhaligon. I am a private investigator. If you have lost a treaty, call the State Department. If you have lost your dignity, call a tailor." Penhaligon didn't flinch. "I have lost neither, Mr. Wolfe. I have lost a deal. A private transaction involving the acquisition of certain historical correspondence letters from a French revolutionary that were to be donated to the Library of Congress. The exchange happened last night. I arrived at the rendezvous, a private residence in Gramercy Park. The seller was there, but the letters were gone, replaced by a folder of blank stationery. And the seller, a man of some repute named Julian Vane, is now claiming I stole them myself to avoid payment." Wolfe's eyes remained closed. For a second I thought he'd fallen asleep, but then I saw the slight movement of his thumbs. He was interested. "You wish me to find the letters to clear your name?" "I wish you to find the letters because they are currently being used to blackmail me," Penhaligon corrected. "The contents are politically sensitive. If they are published or if Vane goes to the press with his accusation, my career, even in retirement, is finished. I am prepared to pay your retainer, $5,000. Wolfe opened one eye. "You mentioned the deal went wrong. That is a vague descriptor. Deals go wrong because of incompetence or malice. Which was it?" Both, the attaché Graves chimed in. He looked like he wanted to jump out of his skin. "We were followed, Mr. Wolfe. Someone knew the location. Someone knew the contents." Wolfe sighed, a deep, billowing sound. He looked at the clock. It was nearly time for lunch. Fritz was doing a fricassee of chicken with dumplings, and a gravy that would make a saint skip vespers. "I do not like the government," Wolfe muttered. "I do not like diplomats. They use words to obscure thought. However, I dislike the theft of historical documents even more. It is a messy business." "Archie, the bank is still open," I said. "And the calendar is clear, unless you want to spend the afternoon arguing with the butcher about the fat content of the lamb." Wolfe turned his gaze to Penhaligon. "I will take your 5,000, but understand this. I do not leave this house. Mr. Goodwin will be my eyes and ears. If you lie to him, you lie to me. If you lie to me, I shall enjoy watching your career evaporate. Do we understand each other?" Penhaligon nodded stiffly. "Perfectly." "Good," Wolfe said, his eyes already drifting toward the door. where the scent of Fritz cooking was beginning to drift in. Archie, get the details. All of them, especially about this Mr. Vane. I find it hard to believe a man named Julian would be careless enough to lose a revolution. I sat at my desk, pulled a fresh sheet of yellow paper toward me, and uncapped my fountain pen. Wolfe shifted in his oversized custom chair, a subtle movement conveying profound suffering. He closed his eyes, leaning his massive head back against the leather upholstery, effectively removing himself from the social equation. It was my cue to do the heavy lifting, a routine we had perfected over the years. "All right, Mr. Penhaligon," I said, looking directly at the former ambassador. "Let's get the car straight for the record. You mentioned the seller. Let's have his real name, not any assumed aliases." Penhaligon stiffened. "His name is Marcus Thorne. He deals in rare manuscripts operating primarily out of London and Geneva. We arranged the meeting at a neutral location, a heavily fortified brownstone in Gramercy Park, owned by a mutual acquaintance. And who else knew you were going to be there, buying these specific French letters at that time?" I asked. Graves, the young attaché, cleared his throat nervously. The circle of knowledge was strictly compartmentalized, Mr. Goodwin. "Compartmentalized is just Washington shorthand for leaky," I told him with a flat smile. "Who exactly was in this watertight compartment?" Graves glanced sideways at his boss, who gave a brief nod. "Myself, of course," Graves said. "Mr. Thorne, the Gramercy property owner Elias Cobb, and Ms. Clara Penhaligon." Behind the desk, Wolfe's eyes remained shut, but his right thumb began to trace a slow, deliberate circle on the polished arm of his chair. He was awake, and he was processing. "Your daughter?" I asked Penhaligon. "Niece," he corrected. "Clara is a senior political consultant here in the city. She possesses a sharp intellect but lacks the necessary virtue of patience. She believed purchasing the letters was a grave mistake. She felt it looked like an implicit admission of historical guilt. Was it?" Wolfe's voice rumbled out of nowhere, deep, resonant, and unmistakably accusatory. "It was pragmatic damage control," Penhaligon snapped. "The letters detail a complex financial arrangement made by my grandfather during the war. It was completely legal at the time, but in today's vicious climate, it would be misconstrued. Clara argued we should let Thorne publish them and fight the narrative in the press. I preferred to bury the narrative entirely, so she had a motive to disrupt the sale, I noted, writing it down. What about Elias Cobb? Why use his place?" "Elias is an old, trusted colleague," Penhaligon explained. "He owes me a favor from our time serving together in Paris. His residence is highly secure, and he has a long-standing reputation for absolute discretion. He was out of town last night, supposedly attending a conference in Boston. He simply provided the keys." "Supposedly is a dangerous word in this room," I said. "Where were you, Graves, while your boss was walking into an empty study?" Graves went pale. "I was stationed 3 blocks away at a coffee shop on 3rd Avenue. My instructions were to wait for the ambassador's signal. If the transaction was successful, he would call. If not, I was to approach the residence. I received no call, so after 20 minutes I approached. By the time I arrived, the ambassador was standing in the study, and the folder of blank paper was sitting open on the desk. Thorne was nowhere to be seen. Thorne wasn't entirely gone, Penhaligon corrected sharply. He was waiting in the shadowed vestibule near the front entrance. When I came downstairs holding the empty folder, he accused me of a cheap sleight of hand. He claimed he had placed the genuine letters on the desk not 10 minutes prior, stepped into the adjacent kitchen for a glass of water, and returned to find me there, and the letters vanished. He demanded his money. I utterly refused. I looked at my yellow pad. "So Thorne thinks you stole them to get them for free. You think Thorne hid them to extort you for more cash. And somewhere in the wings we have a stubborn niece who hates the deal and a helpful friend who might not actually be in Boston. That is the unfortunate summary, yes," Penhaligon said. Wolfe opened his eyes and leveled a cold gaze at the former ambassador. "It is an inadequate summary. It relies on the arrogant assumption that only the 4 of you knew. Secrets of this nature have a distinct odor, sir. They invariably attract flies." Wolfe placed both hands flat on his desk, signaling the end. "Archie, you will visit Mr. Thorne's hotel. You will also locate the niece and determine her exact movements. Diplomats are accustomed to polite evasions. Give them blunt force. Good day, gentlemen. I left the brownstone at 2 o'clock, my stomach pleasantly occupied by Fritz chicken fricassee, and my mind occupied by the peculiar geometry of Arthur Penhaligon's problem. Wolfe had retreated to the plant rooms for his afternoon session, leaving me to beat the bushes. My first stop was the Hotel Pierre, where Marcus Thorne was occupying a suite that cost more per night than most people made in a month. I didn't bother calling from the lobby. I rode the elevator to the 7th floor, found suite 714, and knocked with the rhythmic authority of a man carrying a badge, even though I was only carrying a notebook and a healthy amount of skepticism. A man who looked exactly like the kind of person who makes a living selling other people's old mail opened the door. Thorne was slender, meticulously groomed, and wore a silk smoking jacket that belonged in a 1930s film. He looked at me with bored annoyance. "I assume you aren't room service," he said, his accent carrying the polished vowels of an expensive English boarding school. "Archie Goodwin," I said, handing him a card. "I work for Nero Wolfe. Arthur Penhaligon has retained us." Thorne chuckled, stepping back to let me in. How desperately American. He loses a priceless piece of history, and rather than pay the agreed-upon price, he hires a private detective to intimidate me. "You may tell Mr. Wolfe that my terms remain unchanged. I want my money." "You're assuming he has the letters," I said, walking into a sitting room that smelled of expensive cologne and Turkish tobacco. "He assumes you have them." Thorne poured himself a drink from a crystal decanter. I placed the folder on the desk in Mr. Cobb's study. I turned my back to fetch a glass of water from the adjoining kitchen. I was gone for perhaps 40 seconds. When I returned, the ambassador was standing by the desk. The folder was empty, and the letters had vanished into his coat. "It is a simple case of aristocratic theft." "Why not call the police?" I asked. "Because the provenance of those letters is complicated," Thorne replied smoothly. "And because calling the authorities would alert the press, which is exactly what the good ambassador wishes to avoid." He thought he could outmaneuver me. He was wrong. I left Thorne with his liquor and headed downtown. Clara Penhaligon's political consulting firm occupied half a floor of a glass and steel monolith on Lexington Avenue. The receptionist tried to brush me off, but I used my favorite technique of smiling brightly, dropping Wolfe's name, and refusing to move. 10 minutes later, I was sitting across a slab of frosted glass from a woman who shared her uncle's imposing jawline but possessed a much sharper gaze. "I have precisely 5 minutes, Mr. Goodwin," she said, signing a document without looking up. "I assume Arthur sent you. He's been in a panic since last night. You didn't seem too broken up about his problem," I observed. She dropped the pen and looked at me. "Because the deal was a profound mistake. Those letters are a political liability. Arthur belongs to a generation that believes you can buy silence. You can't. You can only rent it, and the lease is always expiring. Did you cancel the lease?" I asked. "It wouldn't be hard for someone with your resources to arrange a little interruption in Gramercy Park." Clara smiled, but there was no warmth. "If I had wanted to stop the transaction, Mr. Goodwin, I wouldn't have resorted to parlor tricks in a borrowed house. I would have leaked the existence of the letters to the Times a week ago and let the resulting firestorm burn the deal to the ground. Stealing them solves nothing. It merely shifts the liability from the seller to the thief. "Where were you last night at 8 o'clock? "At a fundraising dinner at the Waldorf," she said immediately. "Sitting at the head table with 2 senators and a bishop. A terribly public alibi, I am afraid." I thanked her for her time and hit the pavement. By the time I returned to the brownstone, it was nearly 6. Wolfe was behind his desk, pouring his second beer of the day. "Report," he grunted as I walked in. I sat at my desk and gave it to him verbatim: Thorne's slick confidence, Clara's ruthless logic, and the glaring fact that everyone involved was too smart to be telling the complete truth. Wolfe listened with his eyes closed, his breathing slow and steady. When I finished, he didn't speak long. Finally, he opened his eyes and glared at a spot on the wall. "The letters were not stolen," Wolfe murmured, his voice barely a rumble. "They were relocated. There is a distinction, Archie, a profound one." Thursday morning arrived with a crisp, indifferent breeze that rattled the windows of the brownstone. Wolfe was upstairs in the plant rooms, engaged in his sacred 2 hours with Theodore Horstman and the orchids. I was at my desk in the office, drinking my second cup of coffee and pondering Wolfe's deliberate phrasing from the previous evening. He had stated the letters were not stolen, but relocated. If they were merely relocated, the implication was clear. They had been hidden nearby in a panic or tucked away for later retrieval. The most logical place to look was the scene of the supposed crime itself. I needed to get inside Elias Cobb's heavily fortified Gramercy Park residence. Penhaligon had mentioned that Cobb was out of town in Boston, having provided the keys to facilitate the transaction. That meant the ambassador, or more likely his anxious shadow, Graves, still possessed a means of entry. I picked up the telephone and dialed the Waldorf Astoria, asking to be connected to the attaché's room. Graves answered on the fourth ring, sounding as if he had spent the night staring at the ceiling. It took 3 minutes of applied pressure and a vague threat about Wolfe dropping the case to pry the spare key from his nervous custody. I met him at a crowded diner on 14th Street, where he slid a heavy brass key across the sticky Formica table, looking over his shoulder as if he expected a foreign intelligence agency to arrest him over a plate of scrambled eggs. Gramercy Park remains the sort of neighborhood where even the pigeons look as though they possess inherited wealth. Elias Cobb's property was a 4-story structure of imposing dark brick, guarded by intricate wrought-iron fencing and a heavy oak door. I checked the street, saw nothing out of the ordinary, and used the brass key. I slipped inside, shutting the heavy door and immediately cutting off the ambient noise of the city. The interior vestibule was dim, smelling faintly of lemon oil, expensive floor wax, and old paper. I stood perfectly still for a full minute, letting my eyes adjust to the gloom and listening to the natural settling sounds of an empty house. The study was in the back of the first floor. It matched the descriptions perfectly. A massive mahogany desk dominated the center of the room, flanked by leather wingback chairs and walls lined from floor to ceiling with glass-fronted bookcases. I positioned myself in the doorway and began to visualize Marcus Thorne's claimed timeline. He places the folder containing the letters on the desk. He walks to the adjoining kitchen for a glass of water. He is gone for approximately 40 seconds. When he returns, Penhaligon has arrived and the folder is empty. For the ambassador to steal them, he would have needed to pocket a thick, fragile stack of antique parchment in mere seconds without Thorne noticing the awkward bulk in his tailored overcoat. It was highly improbable. If Thorne had hidden them himself to extort more money, he only had those 40 seconds to do so. I walked into the adjoining kitchen. It was modern, gleaming with stainless steel, and completely devoid of any hiding spots that would not risk destroying fragile historical documents with moisture or heat. I returned to the study and began a methodical physical search. I checked the obvious hollows, the spaces behind the radiators, the gaps beneath the Persian rug, the lower shelves of the bookcases. Nothing. Then I moved to the desk itself. It was a heavy, ornate, antique piece. I knelt and ran my fingertips carefully underneath the broad central drawer. My fingers brushed against a texture that did not belong on polished wood. It was a small square of thick, double-sided adhesive tape. It was freshly placed, but whatever flat object it had been holding was entirely gone. Someone had beaten me to the prize. Before I could process the discovery, a floorboard groaned in the front hallway. It was a subtle sound, but in the absolute silence of the house, it rang like a bell. I did not announce myself. I moved silently across the carpet and slid behind the heavy velvet drapes flanking the large rear window. A silhouette appeared in the study's doorway. The figure entered the room, moving with cautious, deliberate urgency. As the faint light caught the intruder's face, I recognized the sharp, determined jawline immediately. It was Clara Penhaligon. She was carrying a sleek, oversized leather handbag, her eyes darting furiously around the shadowed room. Clara didn't head for the desk. She didn't head for the bookcases either. She walked straight to a small, ornamental terrestrial globe standing on a mahogany tripod in the corner of the room. It was an antique, the kind that looked more like a piece of art than a navigational tool, with faded oceans and Latin inscriptions. She reached out, her gloved fingers tracing the equator of the sphere, and with a practiced twist, she tilted the northern hemisphere back. It wasn't a globe at all, it was a concealed bar, or perhaps just a clever hiding hole. She peered inside, her breath hitching in the quiet room. I stayed behind the velvet drapes, as still as a statue, watching the play of frustration across her features. She reached in, rummaged for a second, and pulled her hand back out empty. Whatever she was looking for, someone had already cleared the shelf. I decided that waiting for her to leave would be a waste of a perfectly good confrontation. I stepped out from behind the heavy fabric, my hands in my pockets, trying to look as though I spent all my Thursday mornings lurking in the shadows of Gramercy Park studies. She jumped, a sharp, choked gasp escaping her throat, and she nearly knocked the globe off its tripod. For a woman who spent her life managing political crises, she looked remarkably like a teenager caught with a hand in the cookie jar. Looking for a drink, Miss Penhaligon? Or perhaps a little light reading from the 18th century? I asked, keeping my voice conversational. She recovered faster than I expected. She smoothed her coat, her eyes narrowing into two flinty chips of blue ice. Mr. Goodwin. I should have known my uncle's expensive watchdog would be sniffing around here. I assume you have a key, or did you learn to pick locks in whatever gutter Nero Wolfe found you in? The key was a gift from Mr. Graves, I said, leaning against the edge of the desk. He's a very generous young man when he's nervous. Now, why don't we talk about that globe? It seemed like you expected to find a prize inside, maybe a stack of letters that could ruin a career. Clara stepped away from the corner, her leather handbag clutched tightly against her side. I don't know what you're talking about. I came here to see if Arthur had left his reading glasses behind. He's been a wreck, as you well know. Reading glasses don't usually require a secret compartment in a fake world map, I noted. And they certainly don't explain why you look like you just lost a winning lottery ticket. You knew the letters were here, didn't you? You didn't want the deal to happen, but once it went sideways, you decided that owning the leverage yourself was better than letting Marcus Thorne have it. Only someone beat you to the punch. She didn't deny it. She was too smart for a flat lie when the evidence was staring her in the face. She took a slow breath, her composure returning like a shield. I received an anonymous tip this morning, Mr. Goodwin. A phone call at my office. A muffled voice told me that if I wanted to protect my uncle, I should look inside the globe, in Elias Cobb's study. I thought perhaps Arthur had hidden them there in a moment of panic and forgotten to tell me. But as you saw, the cage is empty. An anonymous tip, I repeated, skeptical. That's a classic. Usually those lead to a trap or a dead end. In this case, it looks like it led you right into my lap. But while we're talking about things going missing, I found something else. I gestured toward the underside of the desk drawer where the adhesive tape was still tacky. Someone had those letters taped under there. It's a standard trick for a quick handoff. Thorne puts them there, slips away for his water, and the buyer reaches under, grabs them, and leaves the empty folder on top. Only the ambassador didn't grab them. He's too stiff to think of looking under a desk. Clara looked at the desk, then back at me. If Arthur didn't take them, and Thorne claims he left them, then who was the third party? Graves was down the street. I was at the Waldorf. Elias Cobb is in Boston. That's the question Wolfe is currently chewing on while he looks at his Miltonia orchids, I said. But there's one more thing missing. Last night, the ambassador mentioned a small spice jar in the kitchen that looked out of place. He's a man of habit, he notices when things are moved an inch to the left. I checked the kitchen just now. The jar is gone. Someone is tidying up the loose ends, Ms. Penhaligon, and Thea doing a very thorough job of it. She looked at the door, her anxiety finally outweighing her bravado. I am leaving, Mr. Goodwin. If you find those letters, I suggest you bring them to me, not my uncle. He'll only find a way to make the situation worse. I'll tell Mr. Wolfe you said so, I promised. He always appreciates a woman with a dim view of diplomacy. I watched her walk out, the click of her heels echoing through the silent house, leaving me alone with an empty globe and a very sticky piece of tape. I returned to the brownstone just as the clock in the marble hallway struck 4. The house was silent, save for the distant hum of the elevator descending from the roof. Wolfe had finished his afternoon session with the orchids and was now ensconced in his office, a cold glass of beer resting on a coaster and a book on medieval history open in front of him. He didn't look up as I entered, but his nostrils flared slightly, a sign he was waiting for the data I had gathered in the field. I took my seat, clipped my notebook open, and gave him the full rundown: the brass key from Graves, the empty secret compartment in the globe, the double-sided tape under the mahogany desk, and the sudden, frantic appearance of Clara Penhaligon. Wolfe remained motionless until I mentioned the tape. One eyelid flickered. When I finished with Clara's anonymous tip, he finally closed his book with a definitive thud. "A tip," Wolfe murmured, his voice thick with distaste. "An instrument of redirection. It served two purposes, Archie. It removed Ms. Penhaligon from her office, and it placed her at the scene of the disappearance, should a witness be required to testify to her presence. It is a clumsy gambit, but effective for those who deal in shadows." "So she was set up," I said. "But that doesn't tell us who took the letters. If Thorne put them under the desk and the ambassador didn't grab them, someone else had to be in that house. Someone who knew the layout better than a guest." Wolfe reached for the button on his desk and pressed it twice. That was the signal for Fritz to bring more beer, but it also meant Wolfe was ready to expand the scope of our operations. "We require a specialist," Wolfe said, "one who can move through the city without leaving a wake. Call Saul Panzer. Tell him I need Elias Cobb's movements for the past 48 hours. Specifically, I want to know if he actually boarded a train to Boston, and if he did, whether he remained there." I placed the call. Saul answered on the second ring, his voice as steady as a surgeon's hand. I gave him the details, and he promised to have a preliminary report by midnight. Saul is the only man Wolfe truly trusts with the delicate threads of a case. He has a memory like a filing cabinet and a face that disappears into any crowd. While Saul went to work, I spent the evening cross-referencing the guest list of the Waldorf dinner where Clara claimed to have been. She hadn't lied about the senators or the bishop, but she had conveniently omitted the fact that she had left the table for nearly 40 minutes between the main course and the dessert, plenty of time to make a phone call or a quick trip to Gramercy Park if she had a fast driver. At 10 o'clock, the front door pulled me away from the ledger. It wasn't Saul. It was a delivery man with a small, square package wrapped in plain brown paper, addressed to Nero Wolfe. I took it into the office and checked it for anything that might go bang. Finding nothing but the weight of heavy cardstock, I opened it under Wolfe's watchful eye. Inside was a single spice jar, one missing from Elias Cobb's kitchen, and a note written in block capitals. "The price has doubled. Tell the ambassador the clock is ticking." Wolfe leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he studied the jar. It was labeled time, but when I unscrewed the lid, the scent wasn't herbal. It was the sharp, metallic tang of industrial cleaning fluid. "A message," Wolfe whispered. "Not from a thief, but from a saboteur. They are mocking the ambassador's fastidiousness. They are showing him that even his private sanctuary is porous." The telephone rang at precisely midnight. It was Saul. I put him on the speaker so Wolfe could hear. "Cobb never went to Boston, Archie," Saul said. "He checked into a small, third-rate hotel in Queens under the name Smith. He's been there since yesterday morning. But here's the kicker. He hasn't been alone. He's had a visitor twice. A young man, early 30s, very nervous, wearing a high-end overcoat that didn't match the neighborhood. "Graves," I muttered, looking at Wolfe. "Indeed," Wolfe said, his voice cold and sharp. "The attaché and the host conspiring in a burrow while the ambassador plays the victim. It is a pantomime, Archie, a choreographed dance of deception. We have the suspects, we have the motive, and now, thanks to that jar of poison time, we have the pressure. Call them all. Tell them I expect them in this office tomorrow morning at 9. Tell them that if they do not attend, the letters will be delivered directly to the district attorney." "Anton?" I asked. "Especially Mr. Thorne," Wolfe said, finishing his beer. "He is the only one who actually knows the value of the ink on those pages. Everyone else is merely fighting over the paper." The rain had started just after midnight, a steady, rhythmic drumming against the windows of the brownstone that usually put Wolfe in a state of suspended animation. But this morning, as the clock neared 9, he was anything but stagnant. He had descended from the plant rooms early, skipping his final half-hour with the Miltonia orchids to ensure the office was arranged to his exact, idiosyncratic specifications. The chairs were placed in a semicircle, facing his desk like a tribunal. The lighting was dimmed just enough to make the shadows in the corners feel heavy, and the spiced jarth one delivered in brown paper sat dead center on his blotter, a small glass monument to someone's misplaced confidence. I was at the front door playing the role of the Grim Reaper's butler. First to arrive was Arthur Penhaligon, looking as though he hadn't slept since the Eisenhower administration. His charcoal coat was damp, and his hands were shoved deep into his pockets. Behind him, like a nervous shadow, was Graves. The attaché's eyes were darting toward every corner of the hallway, his collar turned up against a chill that wasn't entirely atmospheric. I led them into the office without a word. Wolfe didn't look up. He was busy adjusting the placement of a beer coaster by a fraction of an inch, a sure sign that his internal machinery was humming at maximum capacity. Marcus Thorne arrived 5 minutes later, still wearing that air of bored European superiority. He shook a silk umbrella and gave me a thin, knowing smile. A commanding performance, Mr. Goodwin. I trust Mr. Wolfe has found my property. I told him he'd find out soon enough and pointed him toward the red leather chair. Clara Penhaligon was the last to appear, stepping out of a sleek black sedan and walking up the stoop with the poise of a woman heading into a board meeting she already knew she'd won. She didn't look at her uncle. She didn't look at me. She walked straight into the office and took the chair furthest from the window. The air in the room was thick enough to chew. Wolfe waited until the clock chimed the hour. Then he leaned back, his interlaced fingers resting on his mountain of a stomach. He looked at each of them in turn, a slow, predatory gaze that made even Thorne shift uncomfortably. "We are here," Wolfe began, his voice a low, dangerous rumble, "to discuss the mechanics of a vacuum. You all entered a house in Gramercy Park expecting to find substance, and instead you found an absence. You have spent the last 36 hours accusing one another of theft, blackmail, and incompetence. It has been a tedious exercise in vanity." "We didn't come here for a lecture on vanity," Wolfe Penhaligon snapped, his voice cracking. "We came for the letters. Do you have them or not?" Wolfe ignored him. "The problem with a vacuum is that it must be filled. When the letters vanished from under the desk where Mr. Thorne had so cleverly taped them, they did not simply dissolve into the ether. Someone who understood the architecture of the deal better than the players themselves moved them. Someone who knew that the ambassador would be too dignified to look under a drawer, and that Mr. Thorne would be too arrogant to stay in the room. Someone who had a key, an intimate knowledge of the house, and a desperate need to control the narrative." Wolfe shifted his gaze slightly, landing on the attaché. Graves looked like he was about to faint. "Mr. Graves," Wolfe said, the name sounding like a sentence. "You told Mr. Goodwin you were at a coffee shop. Yet, Mr. Saul Panzer, a man whose eyes are significantly more reliable than your testimony, found you elsewhere. You were visiting a hotel in Queens, a hotel where Mr. Elias Cobb was hiding, despite his claim of being in Boston. Why would a host hide from his own guests, unless the guests were meant to be the victims of a staged robbery?" The room went dead silent. Clara's eyes widened, and she looked at Graves with a mixture of dawning horror and cold calculation. Thorne's boredom evaporated instantly, replaced by a sharp, feral intensity. He realized, perhaps for the first time, that he wasn't the only shark in the water. Wolfe reached out and touched the spice jar on his desk. This jar was a mistake. It was intended to frighten the ambassador, to make him believe a phantom was haunting his footsteps. But phantoms do not use industrial cleaning fluid, and they do not send packages via standard couriers. Only men who are drowning in their own schemes resort to such theatricality. Wolfe leaned forward, the light catching the gold of his ring. "The letters are not in this room, but the person who knows their exact location is, and before the clock strikes 10, that person will speak, or I shall invite Inspector Kramer to finish this conversation in a much less comfortable setting." The silence in the office was no longer a vacuum, it was a weight, pressing down on the 5 people gathered before Wolfe's desk until the very air seemed to thrum with the friction of their nerves. Wolfe sat motionless, a mountain of granite in a tailored suit, his eyes partially lidded as he allowed the implication of his last words to sink into their collective consciousness. I stood by the door, my back against the wood, feeling the familiar hum of a climax approaching. It's a specific kind of electricity that only happens in this room when the genius behind the desk decides to stop playing with his food and starts to bite. "It is a fascinating study in desperation," Wolfe said, his voice dropping to a near whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the room. "Mr. Graves, you are sweating. It is an unseemly look for a man of your ambitions. And you, Mr. Penhaligon, you sit there like a man waiting for a firing squad, yet you haven't asked the one question that a truly innocent victim would have shouted 5 minutes ago. You haven't asked where Mr. Cobb is now. Penhaligon's jaw worked silently for a moment before he found his voice. I assumed, as you said, he was in Queens. He was, Wolfe snapped, his eyes blinking. Until an hour ago when Mr. Panzer escorted him to a more secure location. Mr. Cobb is a weak man, Ambassador. He possesses the refined tastes of a diplomat, but the backbone of a jellyfish. When confronted with the reality of a felony charge, he became remarkably loquacious. He told us about the plan. Not your plan, sir, but the one whispered into his ear by a subordinate who promised him a way to erase his mounting gambling debts without ever having to leave his house. Graves made a sudden, aborted movement as if to rise, but I shifted my weight, and he sank back into his chair, his face the color of damp parchment. Wolfe turned his gaze toward the attaché. The letters were never stolen by an outsider, Mr. Graves. You didn't wait in a cafe. You were inside the house in the basement, watching through a service vent. When Mr. Thorne entered the kitchen for his water, you didn't have to run. You simply reached through the specialized paneling Mr. Cobb had installed for his own voyeuristic tendencies and plucked the letters from the underside of the desk. You replaced them with a folder of blank paper to ensure the ambassador and Mr. Thorne would spend the next hour accusing each other while you slipped out the back. That's a lie, Graves hissed, though his voice lacked any conviction. You have no proof. I have the tape, Wolfe said, gesturing toward the desk. Specifically, the adhesive tape used to secure the letters. It is a specialized industrial brand, used primarily in diplomatic courier pouches for tamper-evident sealing. It is not sold in retail stores. It is, however, available in the supply room of the ambassador's own officer room to which you, as the primary attaché, have unrestricted access. But the tape was not the pivot of your undoing. It was the spice jar. Wolfe picked up the small glass container and held it to the light. You sent this to me as a threat, intending to make it seem as though a third party was blackmailing the ambassador. You wanted to drive him into a panic so he would authorize a discretionary fund to buy back the Laterza fund you would then manage and pocket. But you are a creature of the city, Mr. Graves. You don't understand the chemistry of a kitchen. This jar did not contain thyme. It contained a residue of the same cleaning solvent used by the janitorial staff at the Waldorf Astoria. Clara Penhaligon stiffened. The Waldorf? But I was there. Exactly, Wolfe said. Mr. Graves knew you were there. He knew you had stepped away from the table for 40 minutes. He stole a jar from the hotel pantry during a previous site visit for your uncle's security detail, and he used it to frame you. He wanted the ambassador to believe that you, his own niece, had intercepted the deal to save the family reputation. It was a masterpiece of redirected guilt. He would recover the letters from you, the ambassador would be eternally grateful and silent, and Mr. Graves would walk away with a fortune and a promotion. Graves finally broke. He didn't scream or fight, he simply slumped forward, his head in his hands. He was going to ruin everything anyway. Graves moaned. The letters. They weren't just about the war. They proved the ambassador had been selling influence for decades. I just wanted my cut before the ship sank. You wanted the lever, Wolfe corrected coldly. But you forgot that a lever requires a solid fulcrum. In this house, the only solid thing is the truth. He looked at me. Archie, ring the doorbell. I believe Inspector Kramer has been waiting on the stoop long enough to catch a cold. The office door didn't just open, it swung wide with the weary, heavy-treaded inevitability of Inspector Kramer. He looked like a man who had spent the last hour chewing on a cold cigar and a grudge, his hat dripping onto the Persian rug. Behind him, 2 plainclothes men waited in the hallway like bookends. Kramer didn't look at the ambassador or the trembling attaché. He kept his eyes fixed on Wolfe, who sat behind his desk with the serene expression of a Buddha who had just finished a particularly satisfying meal. I leaned back against the mahogany, watching the scene unfold with the professional detachment of a man who knew the hard part was over and the paperwork was about to begin. All right, Wolfe, Kramer grunted, his voice like gravel in a blender. I've got the boys outside. You said you had the package and the delivery boy. I see a room full of high-priced trouble. Who's going for a ride? Wolfe gestured with a single, elegant motion of his index finger toward Graves. Mr. Graves has been most cooperative, Inspector. He has just finished a rather moving monologue regarding the nature of ambition and the structural integrity of diplomatic pouches. You will find the letters in a safe deposit box at the terminal on 42nd Street. The key, I suspect, is currently nestled in the lining of his very expensive charcoal overcoat. He was kind enough to provide the narrative arc of his own downfall, involving a conspiracy with Mr. Elias Cobb, who is currently being detained by Mr. Panzer. Graves didn't even look up when detectives moved in. They lifted him by the elbows, and he went limp, a hollow shell of a man whose career had just evaporated into the heavy air of the brownstone. As they led him out, Arthur Penhaligon stood up, his face a mask of aristocratic shock. He looked at Wolfe, then at the door, then at his niece, who remained perfectly still, her eyes fixed on the empty space where the attaché had been sitting. "This is an outrage," Penhaligon whispered, though the fire had gone out of his voice. "The scandal, the letters, if they become public record during a criminal trial, the damage to the department will be catastrophic." "The damage was done decades ago, Mr. Penhaligon," Wolfe said, his voice cold and devoid of sympathy. "When you chose to conduct the business of a sovereign nation through the back door of a private residence. You hired me to find the letters. I have found them. You hired me to clear your name. I have cleared it of theft, though I can do nothing for your reputation as a judge of character. My bill will be sent to your office by the morning mail. It will include a premium for the disruption of my household and the psychological distress caused to my chef by the arrival of an unannounced inspector." Kramer lingered for a moment after his men had cleared the room. He looked at the spice jar on the desk, then at me, then back at Wolfe. "One of these days, Wolfe," he muttered, "you're going to pull one of these gatherings, and someone is going to pull a gun instead of a confession. And I'm going to be the one who has to explain why there's a hole in your $1 million desk. The day a diplomat resorts to a firearm in this office, Inspector, is the day I shall retire to a monastery," Wolfe replied. "They prefer the tongue poison. It is quieter and it leaves fewer stains on the carpet. Now, if you'll excuse us, the dinner hour is approaching, and I have had quite enough of the public sector for one lifetime." Kramer left with a huff, and the Penhaligons followed shortly after, exiting the house in a silence that was louder than any argument they could have had. The front door clicked shut, the heavy bolt sliding home with a finality that signaled the end of the intrusion. I walked over to the desk and picked up the spice jar, turning it over in my hand. The industrial solvent still smelled like a hospital hallway. "Well," I said, looking at Wolfe, "that's another 5,000 for the Orchid Fund. And Graves gets a room with a view of the East River. Not bad for a Thursday." Wolfe didn't answer immediately. He reached for the button on his desk and pressed it once. A moment later, Fritz appeared in the doorway, his white apron spotless, his face glowing with the quiet pride of a man who knew exactly what the evening required. "Dinner is ready, Mr. Wolfe," Fritz said. "Thank you, Fritz," Wolfe murmured. He stood up, a slow and tectonic movement that seemed to rearrange the gravity of the room. He adjusted his waistcoat, looked once more at the empty office, and began the long trek toward the dining room. The case was closed, the vacuum was filled, and for the first time in 2 days, the brownstone felt like a home again. I followed him, my stomach reminding me that while justice is fine for the soul, a man still needs to eat. The dining room was bathed in the soft, amber glow of the overhead chandelier, reflecting off the polished surface of the heavy oak table like moonlight on a still pond. Wolfe sat in his reinforced chair at the head, a napkin tucked with surgical precision into his collar, while Fritz moved with the silent grace of a shadow to place a tureen of turtle soup between us. The scent was magnificentiary, thyme, and a hint of cayenne, a fragrant reminder that the world outside, with its grubby diplomats and their perforated secrets, was merely a backdrop to the real business of living. Wolfe took a spoonful, closed his eyes for a duration that would have been a nap for any other man, and let out a sigh that vibrated the crystal. "Salt," Wolfe murmured, his eyes still closed. "The fundamental stabilizer of the human experience, Archie. Without it, the palate is a wasteland. With too much, the essence is strangled. Mr. Penhaligon and his young protege lacked the salt of discretion. They treated statecraft like a spice cabinet, shaking in whatever flavor suited their immediate hunger, never realizing that a deal, once salted with betrayal, cannot be unmade. I reached for the bread. Graves didn't just want salt. He wanted the whole pantry. He figured that if he could hold on to those letters, he'd never have to worry about the price of a lamb chop again. It's funny how a guy who spends his whole day worrying about national security can be so bad at securing his own future. He actually thought he could outbluff you with a jar of hotel cleaning fluid. Wolfe opened his eyes and leveled a gaze at me that was both weary and profoundly focused. The error was not in the bluff, Archie. The error was in the assumption that a vacuum can be maintained. He believed that by removing the letters he had created a space where he could dictate reality. But nature, and certainly the law, abhors a vacuum. Someone will always step in to fill the void. In this instance, it was the truth, which is often the most inconvenient tenant one can host. We ate in silence for a few minutes. The only sound was the rhythmic clink of silver against china. I thought about Clara Penhaligon sitting in the back of that black sedan, wondering if she was going to have to testify against the man who had sat at her dinner table. She had the salt. All right, she was as sharp and caustic as a brine, but even she hadn't seen the betrayal coming from inside the house. It made you appreciate the brownstone. Here, the betrayals were limited to whether Fritz used too much tarragon or if I forgot to log a phone call from a bill collector. What happens to the letters now? I asked, pouring myself a glass of milk. Kramer has them in the evidence locker. Once they get into the court record, want the national sanctity, Penhaligon was crying about going up in smoke anyway. It seems like a lot of work just to end up exactly where they didn't want to be. Wolfe wiped his lips with the corner of his napkin. The letters are artifacts of a previous folly, Archie. Whether they are burned in a furnace or filed in a basement is of no consequence to the orchids. The ambassador wished to preserve a facade. The attaché wished to exploit the rot behind it. Both failed because they ignored the primary law of the lever. To move a weight, one must have a fixed point upon which to rest the beam. They were both standing on shifting sand. They were trying to leverage ghosts. Fritz appeared to clear the soup plates and replace them with a platter of braised endives and poached salmon. Wolfe looked at the fish with the intensity of a general reviewing his troops. Sovereignty, Wolfe continued, is not in an old parchment folder. It is found in the ability to sit at one's own table and eat a meal without the fear of a ghost tapping on the shoulder. Mr. Penhaligon has lost his sovereignty, not to a thief, but to his own history. He is now a ward of the state's mercy, which is a cold bed to lie in. I nodded, finishing my salmon. Well, at least the bank account is $5,000 heavier. That should buy enough peat moss to keep Theodore happy for a month. Wolfe didn't smile her rarely dozebutt. There was a slight softening around his eyes. He reached for his wine glass and held it up to the light, the pale gold liquid shimmering. To the truth, Archie. It is often unpalatable, frequently expensive, and almost always arrives uninvited, but it does, at the very least, allow for a quiet dinner. And a clean desk, I added, raising my milk glass. Until the doorbell rings tomorrow morning. Wolfe let out a grunt that might have been an agreement. He took a sip of his wine, leaned back, and for the first time in 48 hours, the lines of tension on his face vanished. The brownstone had returned to its natural state, a fortress of intellect, guarded by a chef, an orchid tender, and a man who knew exactly where to find the salt. Outside, the rain continued to wash the streets of New York, but inside, the silence was finally, perfectly profound.